Thanks. Okay, can you hear me? Am I on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me, Barbara? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can now.
Now you can? Good, okay. Make sure that both microphones aren't rubbing on my scarf and things. All right. And my clicker is on. We'll just wait for our slides to come on too. It was good to visit with my family last weekend. Keith ended up preaching and I took the children's story. It's no rest on a holiday even when you go to your home church. Okay, the title of our sermon today is Jesus, Replacement and Mission. We're going to jump straight into our passage, which is found in John chapter 2 today. John chapter 2, verse 1 to 12. It's a passage that is known to all of us quite well, but we're going to unpack that passage today and look at some key words within the passage as well. It's the wedding at Cana, and it's known as, of course, as the first miracle that Jesus did in his ministry. So he called the disciples, and this is the very first miracle that is actually recorded. And I'm reading from the New King James Version. It says this: on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. And when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it had come from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And after this he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. When we're in Israel, and you know I like showing these photos because to me the whole Bible came alive in such an incredible way by walking in the footsteps of Jesus. This is the township of what is known today as Cana. Of course, those kind of buildings would not have been around when Jesus was there. And we then went to a part that is believed to be right where this miracle would have happened. As mentioned other times, that there are churches now that are built in those spaces. Ironically, yes, that's me there. I didn't expect I'd be in that photo, but that's the photo I've got, and that had the whole picture of the building. And inside there, it's just a very small church. But to get to this church, you would have to walk down a very narrow street. The bus could not go down it. The cars could not go down it. You would actually have to hop out of the bus and actually walk down the narrow street to there. Today you actually see pictures like this around there as well that actually depict and remind people of the incredible miracle that happened there. Sorry, which microphone is doing that? This one. Okay. Am I better off taking that one and walking with it? Okay, can we turn, you're just to turn the other one off for me, please, so that, okay. A bit tangled up here. Is it untangled? Okay, that should, all right, that'll do me, thank you. We won't get the buzzing. Can you hear me now with this one? Yes? Good. Okay, and so what we see here is the picture of Jesus and the water being poured into the water pots, which we read about, we're going to come to. Now, the book of John was written around AD 96, and as in around 90 odd years after Christ. And at the time, 3 dangers were threatening the Christian church. 3 dangers. There was decline in piety or devotion to God, there was heresy, and there was persecution. And I would say that we are living in days where the same kind of things are happening, wouldn't you agree? Same kind of things are happening. And the theme that is in John particularly is that Jesus is the promised Messiah according to the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And it emphasizes that Jesus is the complete and ultimate revelation of God. He came and he revealed the Father. Jesus said, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." And the purpose of the gospel is that all can have eternal life by believing in Jesus. The familiar verse that we all have is John 3:16, for God so loved the world that whoever gave his son should not perish but have everlasting life. Yeah. And so in the book of John, we see miracles, but they're actually, John calls them signs. And in fact, what's really interesting when you go through the book of John, signs are always linked with the word glory. In the Greek, it's the word doxa. I hope I've pronounced it correctly. And so signs point to something beyond themselves, and the signs relate to the glorification of Jesus. So it's really interesting. If you go through the whole book, there's actually 7, if I remember correctly, it's 7 miracles throughout the book of John. But they're called signs. So when we look at the water being turned into wine that happened at Cana, this particular miracle, why did Jesus attend the wedding? What is the significance of this as the first miracle? And what is the significance of the water pots and also his mother's role? The wedding at Cana actually introduces not only Jesus' ministry straight after the chapter before, we see the calling of the disciples. Jesus calls the disciples and they follow him. He says in verse 43 of chapter 1, he found Philip and he said to him, "Follow me." So he calls the disciples, and then the very first thing that John records is this event in Cana. And it introduces important themes evident throughout the whole book of John, and that functions as a major turning point in the gospel. It relates to Christ's mission and to his ministry on this earth. And so what we see in chapter 2 and going into chapter 3 and then chapter 4, what John does is he introduces this and he speaks about Jesus, how Jesus replaces the old with the new. He replaces the old with the new. So for example, in chapter 2, we see that the waters of Judaism are replaced by the wine of Jesus' blood, and that's what we're looking at today. And further in chapter 2, we see that the temple of Judaism, in other words, what today we would call the church, is replaced by Jesus' own body. And we know that we say this is the church, but the Bible speaks of the fact that we are the church. We are the church. When Christ lives in us, when we have that living relationship with Jesus, we are the church. And we are to be the church to people by who we are. Then chapter 3, which is the common Nicodemus story that we know, we see the physical birth replaced by the spiritual birth. And then in chapter 4, which is the woman of Samaria, Jacob's well, Jacob is replaced by Jesus himself. And we then see the physical water being replaced by the spiritual water that Jesus talks about. He says, I am the living water, doesn't he? And then in chapter 4, further in verses 21 to 24, worship at Jerusalem is replaced by the spiritual worship. Spiritual worship. Interesting. And I'm probably going to look at some of those in more detail in the coming weeks too. But at the moment, this is what God impressed upon me as the one on Cana. And I think it beautifully introduces it to that whole thing of old being replaced by new. And I don't know about you, but I find change sometimes pretty hard. But it's the space where we grow. And Jesus challenged people that it wasn't about their rituals and things, it's about Him. It's about Him. So let's have a look at a few key words. In verses 1 to 3 of chapter 2, what we see is it's mentioned there that He came on the, which day? On the third day. On the third day. And it's likely referring, this third day is likely referring to the third day after Jesus had called the disciples. As I've looked at different, what different authors mention, and as we look into that, the thing is typically weddings, virgins were typically married on about the fourth day. And here we have a mention of the third day. But here's the interesting thing. The third day, in many ways, has a link to the fact that, linking it here to the resurrection of Jesus on the third day. There was a death, and then there was something new through a resurrection, where His ultimate glory would be seen. The word wedding in Greek is the word gamos, which means not only a wedding, but also means wedding festivities. And I think most of us would know that in the Old Testament times, and maybe it's a good thing I wasn't born back then, because I think I'd be pretty tired by the second day. One day of a wedding was plenty. But it's an exciting time. But the thing is, the festivities would go for several days. In fact, in many times it would be for about 7 days. And it was often held in the groom's home. And wedding feasts are actually prominent in the Bible. But here's the interesting thing, is that at the wedding appears to be that it was probably a relative's wedding, since Jesus, His mother, and the disciples were also invited. And also at the end of chapter 12, verse 12 in chapter 2, it also says that His brothers also went to Capernaum. So it looks like it was possibly a family wedding. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, appears to have the role of the matron of honour, telling Jesus there is no wine. Now, weddings were a time of celebration, and of course the wine needed to be in abundance. And it was humiliating for any master of the feast to run out of the wine by the time the whole wedding festivities would finish. And if they ran out, it would become a subject in the village for many years to come. An abundance of wine in Old Testament passages referred to the fact that the future kingdom of heaven was the beginning of the last days. We find that in Isaiah and Jeremiah. The future kingdom of heaven was beginning of the last days. And what we see here is, of course, Jesus is there. He's here at the wedding. And here the wine is represented that God's end time kingdom was starting to be fulfilled through who? Through Jesus. This end time kingdom was starting to be fulfilled through Jesus. And so the role of wine is actually significant. Here it portrays how Judaism is barren. Judaism is barren without the Messiah. Judaism is barren without the Messiah. How can that apply to us? As Adventists, being an Adventist, our lives are barren, and as Adventists representing Jesus is barren without the Messiah. Running out of wine signifies that Judaism is insignificant and it's not complete. And how can that relate to us? Being an Adventist is not sufficient, and we are not complete without a living relationship with Jesus. We can go through the rituals of coming to church. We can go through the rituals of doing Bible study ourselves. But is Christ really, here's the question for all of us, is Christ really at the centre of your life and mine? Is he at the centre of your life and mine? And is he being reflected in who you are? In Cana, when you walk around, these are the kind of pictures you see of the grapes, of course, that depict the fact that of the wine that was served at the wedding feast. And here, what you find around the streets or on the souvenir areas, of course, is little pots that you can buy and take home. That again show the kind of pots that they would have been. They were stone pots. And what you see is these kind of souvenir stores. In fact, I think this is the store where Keith and I bought our 7 candlestick holder that is from the sanctuary, because they had those in different places as well. But here you see souvenir stores. And you see pictures like this, Cana wedding, the first miracle, souvenir stores. And you also see ones like this, the first miracle. And even though the whole thing was about wine, sadly there's more pictures of wine bottles around than there are of Jesus. Replaced. Replacement. An interesting and important word. What do we replace what with what? In verse 4, when we go on to the word hour, Jesus says here, Jesus says to his mother, what does it concern you? What does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Jesus encounters his mother only 2 times in the book of John. She is mentioned here in Cana at this miracle, and she's mentioned at the cross. Another connection that this miracle is connected to the event of the cross. And John therefore brings that strong connection between the two, because Jesus, by responding that my hour has not yet come, why does he respond this way? Well, his agenda now with his mission was not set by his mother, but by whom? By his Father. It was set by his Father. And we're referring to being glorified at the cross and leaving this world to go to his Father. And it was also to fulfill her request in the way she wanted would damage his mission. His hour of glorification is his suffering and the death on the cross. His glorification is actually the suffering and death on the cross, and not a first miracle. as in the ultimate, I should say, the ultimate glorification. And so Jesus fulfilled her request in a way that glorified his mission and resulted in the right belief in him. Verses 5 and 6 then talk about these water pots. In fact, verse 6 says, set there 6 water pots of stone according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. One writer says that there would have been enough, the size of these pots when they were filled would have been enough to fill a Jewish immersion pool for purification ceremony. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that, what I think you would all agree with, is that the size of these pots would have been absolutely massive. Massive. And the pots were reserved for ritual purification, for the purification ceremonies. And it was and John mentions the specific size, which is really interesting. Have you ever wondered why he mentions that specific size? Some writers suggest that it's possibly to rebuke the Jews about their obsession with purification rituals, matters, that is, in rituals that are not important. Since Jesus here values the host's honour and the people above a ritual purity custom. Jesus values the hosts and the people. And then verse 7 and 10 also bring up the fact about fill the water pots with water. Jesus says, fill them with water, and they fill them to the brim. And it's interesting here that fresh water was actually difficult to come by. And yet Jesus actually asked them to use water, fresh water. It reminds us of the fact that during the Exodus, Moses turned water into blood. Elisha transformed bitter water of Jericho to taste good and to be useful. And at Elisha's command, the miracle of water appeared as red as blood. And we're told there that Israel won the victory over Moab. It's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3 if you want to go home and read that part. But it's interesting, there was a replacement rather for the water, there was blood, signifying something new. And it's interesting that with Elisha's command, what then happened that followed was victory. And when Jesus is at the centre of our lives, and we reflect him, and it comes in such a natural way because we have that living relationship with him, the thing is, there is victory in Jesus. There is victory in Jesus. And we find here too that Jesus provides exceptional and abundant wine at this banquet. And John here shows the significance relating again to the end time fulfillment of the future kingdom of heaven. That Christ and the kingdom of heaven were actually already present there in reality. Present right there. In fact, I heard a sermon recently where the preacher said, heaven, when we think of the kingdom of heaven, in many ways we often think of it as a place. But the kingdom of heaven, he said, is a person. It comes through a person, it comes through Jesus. The kingdom of heaven, in many ways, is Jesus. And Judaism was concerned with water for washing. They did not recognize the spiritual wine that was present amongst them in the person of Jesus. How detrimental. Judaism was concerned with their rituals, with the water for washing, and they didn't recognize the spiritual wine. Can we get caught out sometimes too like that? Get caught up in certain things and not recognize the importance of that spiritual being in Jesus and what he brings. And so the role of the wine symbolized the barrenness of Judaism without the Messiah. And the replacing of water represented through the wine represented what Jesus offers, is so much better. And how does that apply again to us? Again, for us as Adventists, for you and I, is Jesus at the centre of your life, and do you reflect him? And the wine also pointed, of course, to Christ's sacrifice on the cross that is the only way to eternal life. And by filling these jars to the brim, it shows that when we believe in Jesus, he provides for us abundantly. His grace overflows and we don't need to work for our salvation. Glory, hallelujah, I say for that. We don't have to work our way to heaven. It's our works are a response to what Jesus has done for us already on the cross. And by filling the jars to the brim, it shows us that we can be complete in Jesus. And also what we see there in the passage, it speaks of the hour of Jesus, as well as the head caterer, who had no idea where the wine had come from in verse 9. And it represents that Judaism failed to not only recognize Jesus, but also his mission. Do we recognize Jesus' mission? Do we recognize that this replacement is reflected then in mission by who we are and how we are within our community, how we are in our homes, how we are with one another? And here's the beautiful thing. Here's the climax. In verse 11 it says this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. As a result of the fact, not just of the sign, but the fact that his glory, Christ's glory, the Father's glory was manifest, the disciples believed in him. And I'm sure all those around, many believed in him. It brought belief to these new followers of Jesus that he had called. Jesus, replacement, and mission. They all go hand in hand. And so in conclusion, John 2 verses 1 to 12, the water turning to wine at Cana, being turned to wine at Cana, shows us this. It shows us firstly that Jesus offered something better than Judaism. And he replaced the rituals with waters of Judaism by the wine of his blood. It shows us that Jesus' character, mission, and his glory were revealed, and the disciples believed in him. And it shows us that it pointed to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection at the cross, and ultimately his glorification. So the question for each one of us is this. The questions are, what parts of your life are you allowing Jesus to replace? How have you allowed Jesus to replace old things, old ways, old habits with something better and with something new? And are you allowing him to work in and through you so that others may believe and God's name be glorified? As we contemplate those, may God be the centre of your life and mine as we contemplate these, not only today, but in the coming weeks. May he be the centre of your life and mine, so that his name and his alone may be glorified, is my prayer.